She stood at the edge of 75 acres of ash-gray earth, holding a bill of sale that had cost her nearly everything she owned, and the auctioneer, a wide-shouldered man named Cal Morrow, with ink on his sleeve cuff, had watched her sign it with an expression that was not quite sympathy but was close enough to make her look away. The land was called Cinder Flats. It had been called that for 20 years, and the name fit. 75 acres of pale, compacted soil the color of old fireplace ash, sitting in the low basin of Redstone County, Texas, ringed by mesquite hills that still held color and grass. The flats itself had neither. 3 previous owners had tried it. A dry goods merchant named Pickett had filed the first homestead claim in 1869 and abandoned it in 1872. A family from Kansas had tried a second time in 1876 and left after a single summer. The most recent owner, a cattleman named Errol, had run 8 head on it for 4 months, watched them lose weight steadily, and driven them out. The county had taken the parcel for unpaid taxes and listed it at a starting bid of $50. Nobody bid. Not at 50. Not after Morrow dropped it to 40. Not after he dropped it to 30 and cleared his throat and looked out at the small crowd gathered on the steps of the Redstone County Land Office on a Wednesday morning in the spring of 1889. Then Neva Colton raised her hand. She was 29 years old, lean in the way of someone who had been working rather than eating for most of the past year, with brown hair pinned up under a gray felt hat and a single canvas bag sitting at her feet. She had arrived in Redstone 2 weeks earlier, on the stage from Amarillo, which was where she had come from after selling the house. Her husband's house, technically, though she had lived in it for 6 years, and the furniture inside it, and the 2 horses in the back lot, and everything else that could reasonably be converted into cash after Thomas died of fever in October. She had come to Redstone because land was cheap here, and because a woman she met on the stage platform in Amarillo, heading back to her own dry farm east of town, had told her the county was selling off parcels that other people had given up on. She had not asked why people gave them up. $30, Neva said clearly. Morrow blinked. The crowd shifted. A voice from the far left said, without particular urgency, 45. The man who belonged to that voice was Douglas Vance. He was 52 years old, broad through the shoulders, and wore the look of a man for whom money was not a variable, but a condition, something that had always been present and never required tending. He owned the Vance Ranch, which ran along the northern ridge of the county and controlled the headwaters of Redstone Creek, the only reliable surface water in the basin. He had no real need for Cinder Flats. But he had an established habit of closing doors before other people walked through them. 50, Neva said. The crowd was quiet in the specific way of small groups watching something unexpected unfold. She paid $380 that morning. It was most of what she had. The money had come from the house sale, the horses, 2 months of wages from the laundry operation in Amarillo, and a small amount her mother had pressed into her hand at the stage door in a way that made clear she did not expect to see it returned. Neva had not made the decision easily, and she had made it without consulting anyone, which meant the weight of it sat entirely on her own shoulders. When Morrow handed her the paperwork, she signed it with a steady hand and folded the deed into her coat pocket without reading it again. Vance walked past her as the crowd dispersed. He didn't say anything. He looked at the folded paper in her pocket, the way a man looks at a move on a board he hadn't expected but wasn't particularly worried about. Then he put on his hat and walked to his horse without looking back. The land was worse than it looked from the road. Neva borrowed a mule from the livery and rode out the same afternoon, following the county map Morrow had sketched for her on the back of a receipt. The access track died out a quarter mile from the property line, swallowed by scrub, and she went the rest of the way on foot. Cinder Flats from the inside was not dramatic. It was not even strange. It was just gray and flat and dead in the unremarkable way of land that has been giving up for a long time. The soil surface was hard-packed and pale, almost white in the direct sun, with a faintly powdery texture that rose in small clouds around her boots when she walked. Nothing grew on it except a few brittle weeds at the very edges where the flats met the mesquite hillside. There was no shade. The afternoon heat sat directly on everything without mercy. She walked the property for an hour, going slow, watching the ground. In 3 places where the surface had cracked along old seam lines, She knelt and scraped away the pale crust with the edge of her boot heel. Below it, the soil was darker. Not dramatically, not black, not rich-looking, not anything that would catch a person's eye from a distance, but darker and finer-grained, and in one low spot near the southeast corner, noticeably cooler when she pressed her palm flat against it. She dug down a few inches with a stick and found the texture changed, less powdery, slightly cohesive, the kind of soil that had once held moisture and still remembered how. She sat back on her heels and looked at the surface around her. The pale crust was the problem. Everything worth knowing about this land was underneath it. She had learned this from a woman named Greta Holm. Greta was 63 years old and had been farming the same hardscrabble patch of ground east of Redstone for 31 years, on a property everyone in the county had told her was too rocky to support a crop. She had proved them wrong by a method more patient than dramatic, and she had developed a local reputation as someone whose opinions on land were either ahead of their time or simply wrong, depending on which neighbor you asked. Neva had met her the week after arriving in Redstone, when she had knocked on the wrong door asking for directions to the land registry, and Greta had answered it, looked her over once, and said, "Come inside, I'm making coffee." 3 hours later, Neva was still at the kitchen table. Cinder Flats, Greta had said at one point, in the tone of a woman pulling up something she had thought about before. That ground used to be alive. Not thriving, but alive. She had paused. Redstone Creek ran through it once. Neva had looked up. There's no creek on the land now. No, it diverted. 20-some years back. Greta had been quiet for a moment. Vance's father built a berm upstream to redirect the flow north across his own property. Legal at the time, maybe. The old-timers argued about it, but the creek ran through the flats for maybe a century before that, saturated the clay layer underneath the surface. Greta had set down her cup. Once the water was gone, the surface compacted and the minerals came up. That gray crust you see is just what happens to good land when you cut off its water and leave it to sit. So the soil underneath is still there, Neva had said. I expect it is. Whether there's enough water to access anymore, I can't tell you. Greta had looked at her steadily. But there's a way to find out. Hogs. Neva had not expected that answer. Not domestic hogs, or not just domestic hogs, old breed razorbacks or a cross of them, the kind that root deep. They don't eat the surface grass the way cattle do. They work the ground from below. You put 50 of them on that crust and give them a season. They'll break through it in a way no plow will manage without a team of 6. And then, what? Then you'll know what you actually have. Neva had spent the 2 weeks before the auction doing exactly what Greta told her. She found a hog supplier named Quirk south of the county line, who ran a mixed razorback operation and who sold her 48 animals at a price that used the last significant reserve she had. She arranged a pen and basic shelter on the property. She found a room to rent in Redstone above the hardware store, paid a month in advance, and set up her situation, her books on the windowsill, her papers on the table, her spare boots under the bed. The town noticed her the way small towns notice newcomers who do something nobody expected. She heard things at the edges of conversations, a comment in the feed store about the woman who bought Cinder Flats, a pause in the mercantile that was slightly too long when she walked in. She didn't let it occupy her. She had things to do. The Hogs arrived on a Thursday, driven in a wagon by Quirk himself, who shook her hand at the property line and said, "They're not easy animals, ma'am," and looked at the gray flat ground around her and left without adding anything else, because there was nothing useful to add. They were not easy animals. That turned out to be an understatement. The Hogs were loud, aggressive, and operated with a kind of territorial certainty that took no interest in the opinions of the person who had purchased them. Every fence section needed testing within the first 48 hours. The largest animal, a wide-shouldered boar, she eventually began calling Bishop because of the authoritative way he moved through the others, dismantled a corner post on day 3 by sheer persistent pressure, and had to be relocated before the gap became a general escape route. The boy who showed up to help in the second week was named Bo Kirby. He was 16, the youngest son of a family that ran a modest grain operation on the property adjacent to her eastern fence, and he arrived at her gate one morning and leaned on it and said, "I heard you got razorbacks." "I do. Nobody else out here runs razorbacks." "I know." He had the look of a boy who collected unusual information as a hobby and found most people's ordinary problems far less interesting than the unusual ones. He considered her for a moment. "I'll help if you need it. I don't need pay right now. I just want to see what they do to the ground." She studied him. "You'll work when I say and quit when I say." "Yes, ma'am." "If you do something wrong, I'll tell you." "Yes, ma'am." "All right," she said. The first weeks were hard in the specific way that beginnings are always hard. Not catastrophic, just relentless. 2 hogs got through a gap in the south fence and rooted up a dry wash that technically belonged to a man named Gus Fenner, who ran a small horse operation 2 properties over. Fenner arrived at her gate at 7 in the morning, with his arms crossed and a prepared expression. Neva met him there and offered to pay for any damage before he finished telling her what it was, which reorganized the conversation in a way that left him uncertain what he had come for. She paid him a fair amount from the small reserve she kept in a tin under the floorboard, more than the damage was worth. She paid it anyway, because she was going to be this man's neighbor for a long time, and she was not going to spend that time carrying a debt of ill will she could have prevented for $15. After Fenner left, Bo appeared from behind the far pen and said, "You didn't have to pay that much." "Bo," she said, "I'm not going to fight about money with neighbors I need to live next to for the next 20 years. That's not how you build a place in a community." He was quiet in the way of someone absorbing a principle he hadn't considered before. Then he picked up his tools and went back to work. The hogs went to work. By the end of the 3rd week, they had churned the surface of the southern quarter of the property into something unrecognizable. The pale crust was broken apart in uneven chunks, turned under, mixed with the darker soil below. It was not pretty. It looked, from the road, like devastation. But where they had rooted deepest, near the bottom of the natural slope, the upturned earth was almost black. Not gray, not pale, but a deep, dense brown black that held a different smell. Cooler, faintly mineral, like earth that had been underground for a long time and was only now getting its first breath of air. Neva walked that churned ground every morning before the light turned harsh. She took notes in a small book she kept in her apron pocket. She was looking for one thing specifically, and in the 4th week she found it. At the base of the long southern slope, where the hogs had rooted consistently and returned to daily, a thread of moisture was visible in the freshly turned soil. Not a puddle, nothing so obvious as that. Just a faint darkening that held through the morning, even as the sun climbed, and everything else dried out by 9 o'clock. This small patch did not. She crouched over it for a long time. Then she took out her notebook and wrote one line, "Water below, close." She wrote to Greta that evening, describing what she had seen in exact terms. Greta wrote back in 5 days. The letter was short. "That moisture pattern doesn't come from dew. Something is moving underneath that slope. Let the hogs work it. Stay off that area yourself. Let them find what they're finding." She folded the letter into her notebook and told Bo to stop redirecting Bishop away from the southeast corner. The big boar had been returning to the same low spot every afternoon, with the focused attention of an animal that had identified something of interest and was not prepared to be talked out of it. She didn't tell Bo why. She had told no one about the moisture except Greta. The land was keeping something, and she was not ready to share it yet. The town was beginning to notice the property in a different way by the 5th week. Constance Morell, who ran the Redstone Mercantile, and who had been politely distant in the way of a woman still forming her opinion, softened noticeably when Neva came in for supplies one Saturday and said, with the directness of a woman who preferred plain talk, "I heard your flats are looking different from the road." "Different? How?" "Just different," Constance said. "Less flat." "That's the hogs." Constance studied her for a moment over the counter. "Douglas Vance was in here Tuesday." She paused. "He asked whether you had investors coming in." Neva kept her hands still on the counter. "What did you tell him?" "That I didn't know of any." Constance handed her the package of flour. "He's paying attention to your property, Neva. I thought you should know that." Neva walked back to her room that afternoon and sat at the small table for a long while, thinking through what Vance's attention meant practically. She came to the same conclusion twice and didn't like it either time. He was watching because something had changed on the flats. When he understood what it was, he would move on it. He had more legal resources than she did, and he had the county assessor, a careful man named Otis Falk, in his general orbit in the way that wealthy men keep useful people close without ever having to explain the arrangement. She started keeping better records after that. Every hour worked, every section broken, every animal count, every moisture observation. Not because anyone required it, but because records were a form of evidence, and she was beginning to understand she might need evidence. She also quietly asked Beau's father, Harold Kirby, if he knew a reliable lawyer in the nearest large town. Harold said, "There's a man in Colby named Solomon Price. He's honest. That's the main thing you need." Neva wrote to Price that week. She didn't have a specific legal problem yet. She just wanted him to know her situation existed. Bishop found the seep on a Thursday morning in the 9th week. Neva was repairing the north fence when Beau came around the corner of the barn at a pace that was faster than his usual walk and said, "You need to come see what Bishop is doing." She set down the wire and followed him. The boar was at the southeast corner, the low spot he had been returning to daily, and he was doing something she had never seen a hog do. He was rooting continuously in one spot, not moving across the ground the way hogs normally worked, but pressing down at the same point over and over, going deeper each pass, with a focused intensity entirely different from his usual behavior. Around him, 8 other hogs had stopped their own rooting and were standing in a loose ring, watching him. Hogs did not normally watch each other. She stood at the edge of the rooted area and watched Bishop work for 3 full minutes. Then she walked to the spot and crouched. The soil under her fingers was wet, not damp, wet, cool and dark and wet, and it was not pulling from a night rain because there had been no rain in 12 days. It was coming from below. She pressed her palm flat and felt it. A very faint upward movement, almost nothing, the way water behaves when it has found a root through compacted ground and is cautiously exploring it. She looked up at Beau. His expression was the expression of a 16-year-old who has just understood that something significant is happening and has no idea what to do with his face about it. "Is that?" he started. "I think so." "What do we do?" She looked at the wet ground, at Bishop pressing methodically at the edges of the spot, at the ring of watching hogs. "We don't tell anyone yet, and we get something we can dig with." It took them 2 days of careful work, moving Bishop and the others off each morning to work quietly, going down through the churned soil layer by layer. Beau brought shovels from his father's barn, without explaining why, and Neva did not ask what he had said. On the second afternoon, at roughly 3 feet down, the shovel struck something that was not soil. Stone flat, fitted limestone set in a ring. They looked at each other. It took another hour to clear enough of the perimeter to understand what they were looking at. A stone-lined shaft, roughly 2 feet across, fitted limestone in a circular pattern, going down into the dark. The stone was old. Older than the county's current settlement, Neva thought, looking at the way the edges had softened with time and the joints had tightened with settled earth. She went down on her hands and knees and put her ear to the opening. Water, not standing water, moving water, faint and constant, somewhere below. She sat back on her heels. Beau crouched on the other side of the shaft. "That's a spring," he said. She nodded. "An old one. A very old one." She looked at the fitted stones. Someone built this, and then someone covered it. She paused. This is what cut off the water, not just the berm upstream. He was quiet, working through it. "Or both," she said. "Vance's father blocked the creek upstream 20 years ago, but this shaft predates that. Whoever covered this, maybe the same people who blocked the creek, wanted this land to fail, wanted it to look like it had nothing." Beau looked at her steadily. Why would anyone want that? She knew the answer. It was the same reason Vance was watching her property now, the same reason Constance had warned her, the same reason 3 families had walked away from the flats without finding what lay 2 feet below the surface. Water was the most valuable thing in Redstone County. It had always been, and a man who controlled all of it had reasons to make sure no one else discovered any. She replaced the covering stones as carefully as she could and went back to town and sent a telegraph to Solomon Price in Colby that afternoon. She described the spring in plain, precise language and asked him two things: what documentation she needed to secure her legal claim to it, and what Douglas Vance's water rights on the property to the north actually covered. Price's reply came 4 days later. It was direct in the way she had come to appreciate. Your land title includes subsurface water rights as described in the county deed. A documented underground source on your property belongs to you under county statutes, provided the title is uncontested and the source is registered before any competing claim is filed. Vance's water rights cover surface diversion of Redstone Creek under an 1871 county permit. They do not extend to springs or subsurface sources on neighboring properties. Have your boundary survey done immediately, before anything else. The survey cost money she didn't have, so she pulled it from the reserve she'd been building toward lumber for a second hog shelter. The shelter could wait. The surveyor, a methodical man named Crab, who had been doing boundary work in Redstone County for 19 years, spent 2 days on the property and asked no questions about the urgency. When he finished, the eastern boundary that Price had flagged as potentially vulnerable was documented and confirmed as hers by 14 feet. She filed the survey with the county land office the same afternoon, then filed the spring registration 2 days later with Price's guidance. She did all of this quietly, moving through the administrative steps the way you move through a problem when you know someone else may be paying attention, carefully, without signaling what she was doing or why. The spring stayed covered. She and Beau had an unspoken agreement that the southeast corner was not a topic of conversation in any context where someone outside the property might hear. But in a dry county, you cannot hide water forever. The drought arrived in August the way drought arrives in West Texas, not gradually but as a decision. Redstone Creek dropped to a trickle within 3 weeks. The Kirby grain operation lost its late crop. Families who had never worried about water began hauling it from the county depot at prices that rose every week. Neva's property was different, and the difference was visible from the road. The worked sections of the flats stayed dark and cool when the surrounding land turned to cracked yellow hardpan. Her hogs were healthy and gaining weight. The southeast corner, where the spring sat covered beneath its stone cap, known only to her and Beau and Greta, was visibly greener than anything else in the basin. People slowed their wagons on the Redstone Road and looked. Fenner came back on a Tuesday afternoon with his hat in his hands and said he had 6 horses that were going to start struggling if the depot situation didn't ease. He didn't ask directly. He just stood at the fence and said it, and Neva looked at him for a moment. "Give me a week," she said. He nodded and left, and she went inside and wrote to Price. It was time. The well casing went up in 6 days. Harold Kirby brought 2 of his sons and they built it properly. Timber frame, windlass, cedar bucket, over the stone shaft on the southeast slope. After Neva spent a full day clearing and widening the opening, and Greta went down on a rope with a lantern and came back up with wet hands and an expression that was as close to uncomplicated happiness as Neva had ever seen on her face. The water was cold, clear, and consistent. Greta estimated the flow from below at more than the immediate basin would need. It was fed from deep, she said, from the same aquifer that had once supplied the creek through here before the Vance family redirected it upstream and sealed the shaft. The spring had not been killed. It had just been covered and then forgotten, and then the land above it had been allowed to die so that no one would think to look. She sent word through Constance Morell on a Thursday. Constance was the right channel, and Neva had known it for weeks. She told Constance she was opening the spring to community water access on Sunday morning and described the terms she had decided on: a cash rate below the county depot price for those who could pay, labor credit for those who couldn't, and no cost for families in direct hardship. Constance listened without interrupting. Then she said, "Vance will not like this." "I expect not." Constance was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'll make sure people know. Sunday morning, I'll be there with my account books." Neva hadn't asked for that. She said, "Thank you, Constance." "Don't thank me. Just make sure the water is what you say it is." "It's better," Neva said. The Saturday before the opening, Vance sent his lawyer. A man named Calder arrived at her gate in a good coat with the practiced ease of someone who delivers difficult news as a profession. He introduced himself and began explaining that given the drought conditions and the county's interest in equitable resource allocation, and given Mr. Vance's existing water management agreements with the county. She let him get that far. "Mr. Calder," she said, "I filed registration of this spring with the county land office 18 days ago. That filing predates any action by Assessor Falk or any other county official by more than 2 weeks. My attorney in Colby has copies of everything. If Mr. Vance has a legal objection, he is welcome to bring it before a judge." Calder looked at her for a moment without speaking. He had the expression of a man whose prepared remarks had found no purchase. "Sunday morning at 9, she said. "Anyone with water needs is welcome to attend." She went back inside. Her hands, once she was out of sight, were shaking slightly. She pressed them flat against the table until they steadied. Then she wrote a short telegraph to Price, sat for a few minutes doing nothing, and went out to close up the pens for the evening. On Sunday morning, 53 people came to Cinder Flats. By 9 o'clock, they were standing on the churned slope below the well casing, more than she had expected by 30, ranchers and farmers and families she half recognized from the depot line, all of them standing on the broken crust ground that smelled different from the surrounding county. Cooler, more specific, the faint mineral smell of water working through old earth. She stood at the well and told them the terms. The rate was fair. People heard it and made the comparison to the depot price in their heads, and the sound that moved through the crowd was not protest. Fenner was there. The Kirbys were there in force. Constance Morell stood near the casing with her glasses on her head and her account books under her arm. Greta stood at the edge of the gathering with her arms folded, watching everything with the quiet attention of someone who has been part of a story since the first chapter and wants to see how it ends. Then Douglas Vance walked through the gate with Otis Falk beside him. The crowd shifted to let them through without particular deference. The instinctive rearrangement of people who understand something significant has entered the situation. Vance moved to the front and stopped 10 feet from where Neva stood. He looked at her. He looked at the casing, the stone shaft, the cedar bucket hanging on the windlass rope. He looked at the crowd. She watched him read it. He was a capable man, and he read it accurately. 53 people standing on this property in a drought, people who needed water and had just been offered it at a price they could actually meet, were not going to respond well to a wealthy man arriving with a government official to explain why things were more complicated than they appeared. He had the legal resources. He did not have the room. Falk stepped forward. Vance put a hand on his arm. Falk stopped. Vance looked at Neva. Whatever he was feeling, he was not going to show it in front of this gathering. The county will need to confirm water quality standards before ongoing community access can be formalized, he said. His voice was even. "I'll welcome a county inspection," Neva said. "Full access to the site, anytime. In the meantime, the water doesn't stop." He held her gaze. Behind him, the line at the well had already begun forming. Fenner's ranch hand with an empty barrel, the Kirby family with 2 wagons, a woman Neva recognized from the dry goods store holding a child against her hip. He stepped back, said something quiet to Calder, and walked out the gate with Falk and his 2 men behind him. Calder followed last. The crowd exhaled. It was not a cheer. Something quieter than that, and more real. People began moving toward the well, toward Constance and her account books, toward each other in the small, deliberate conversations of people working out practical arrangements. Bishop had gotten through the fence from the hog pen somehow, and was attempting to push to the front of the line. Bo was trying to redirect him with both hands, and was failing entirely. Fenner found Neva at the edge of the gathering, and stood beside her for a moment. "I was wrong about you," he said. He said it in the way of a man saying something he has been sitting with for several weeks. "You weren't wrong," she said. "You just hadn't seen enough yet." He nodded slowly, turning that over, and walked off to talk to Constance about the barrel rate. The county water inspection came 2 weeks later. 2 men from Falk's office spent a full day at the well with equipment and clipboards. The report came back 10 days after that. The water met every applicable standard, no restrictions recommended. Falk signed it. Whatever Vance had said to him in private, Falk was apparently not prepared to falsify a public health document over it, which Neva acknowledged to herself was a form of integrity she had not fully counted on. She filed the inspection report with the spring registration and wrote to Price. His reply was brief. Good. Hard part is over. Long part begins. The drought broke in December. 3 days of real rain, the kind that fills things. Redstone Creek came back to half its normal flow within a week. People who had been coming daily to the flats reduced their frequency, which was exactly what she had expected and planned for. The water income decreased. The hog operation, now expanded to 61 animals with a second pen bow, had helped her build, continued without interruption. The lard and cured pork she had been selling through Constance's store, since the 5th month had a standing account with a hotel kitchen in Colby that was still running. She was not getting rich. She was building something, which is a different process and considerably more demanding on every level. It was in January that Vance came to her property for the second time. He came alone. He knocked at the gate rather than walking through it, which was different from his first visit, and she noticed the difference. She went out to meet him. He looked changed from the summer. Not smaller, he was not that kind of man, but recalibrated, the way a person looks after spending several months thinking hard about something and arriving somewhere they had not expected to be. My legal fees through the fall were significant, he said. It was not what she had expected him to begin with. I expect mine were too, she said. He looked past her at the property. The pens, the broken crust sections, where the soil had been turned, and was now beginning to show the first thin threads of native grass coming up through the dark earth, the well casing on the southeast slope catching the winter light. I want to ask you something directly, he said. Go ahead. When you opened the well in August, he paused. You could have charged what people would have paid in a drought. That number would have been significant. Yes. You didn't. Because this is where I intend to live for the next 30 years, she said. And you can't live somewhere for 30 years if the people around you carry how you treated them when they needed something. She paused, also because it was the right thing to do. I try to do that when I can figure out what it is. He was quiet. He looked at the ground for a moment. I have 40 cattle, he said. The creek is still running low. I want to purchase water access at your posted rate. Whatever you charge Fenner and the Kirbys, I'll pay the same. No special arrangement, the same rate. She opened the gate. Come see the operation, she said. Then we can talk about schedule. He came through, and she walked him around. The pens, the turned sections of the flats, where the soil was doing something slow and real in the absence of the crust that had smothered it for 20 years, the spring. He stood at the stone casing and looked down for a long time. How deep is the water surface? 30 feet down. Below that, we haven't fully measured, but Greta estimates the source at more than the county can use. It hasn't dropped noticeably since August, not even through the worst of it. He straightened and looked at her. I had a lawyer go through the old property records last fall, he said. Someone covered this shaft in 1867. Same year my father filed the creek diversion. She had suspected something like that. She didn't say so. He looked at her steadily. You know what that means. She did. It meant the land had been deliberately killed. 3 families had failed on the flats not because the land was bad, but because someone had made sure it couldn't succeed. The crust, the dead surface, the livestock losing weight, all of it downstream of a decision made before any of them were born. Go see Constance tomorrow morning, she said. She'll set up the account. He nodded, walked back toward the gate, paused with his hand on the post. I misjudged you, he said. It was a statement, not an apology. The distinction was his, and she let him keep it. You misjudged the land, she said. I was just the person who didn't. He rode out. She stood at the fence until the sound of his horse faded into the January air. Bo came around from the far pen with a bucket and stopped when he saw her expression. Was that Vance? She said, yes. What did he want? He's going to buy water. Bo set the bucket down and stared at the gate, then at the spring, then at the acres of broken and recovering ground below it. Then he looked at her. How do you feel about that? She thought about it for a moment. Like it's the right outcome, she said. Not a victory, just the right outcome. He considered this. Is there a difference? Yes. A victory means someone lost. This is just everyone getting what they need. She turned toward the pens. Come on. Bishop got out again, and he's rooting in the east section. He grinned and followed. By spring, the southeastern quarter of the flats was unrecognizable from the road. The broken crust sections had been worked down through the winter and then left alone, and the dark soil beneath was doing what good soil does when given light and water and time. Native grasses came up first, thin and low, then thicker. In the lowest area near the spring, where moisture reached the surface consistently, the ground was green in a way that made people slow their wagons on the Redstone Road and look. She heard from Constance that Vance had slowed his wagon there twice. She had not planned any of this. She had planned to buy cheap land and find out what was underneath it. Everything else had followed from that, from the hogs and the spring and the records she had kept, and the way she had priced the water, and the way she had treated Fenner at her gate, and the way she had talked to Vance when he came to her the second time. Small decisions, made consistently over 9 months. That was the whole of it. She walked the full 75 acres on a Sunday morning in April, the first time she had done it without stopping to work. The light was young and cool, and the whole basin was visible from the ridge near the spring. The green of her recovered sections, against the still gray edges where the hogs hadn't reached yet, the Kirby grain fields beginning to show color to the east, the Vance cattle visible on the northern ridge, and beyond all of it the wide, flat country of Redstone County coming back to itself after the drought, quietly, without announcement. Bishop was moving through the last corner of the northern section, with the rest of the herd behind him, working the remaining unbroken crust without hesitation, without slowing down, pressing into the gray wall of it with the total confidence of an animal who has never once considered that the thing in front of him might not eventually give way. She watched him for a moment. Then she pulled her notebook from her apron pocket and stood in the morning light and wrote one line at the bottom of the current page, not for any record or document or legal filing, just because it was true and she wanted it written somewhere. The land was never worthless. It was just waiting for someone who understood that dead-looking and dead are not the same thing. She closed the notebook and put it back in her pocket and walked down to open the pens. The hogs went into the last corner of the flats, and the work continued, and the spring kept its water cold and clear, and the ground did what ground does when the thing smothering it is finally removed. It came back, slowly and without ceremony, the way things always come back when there is nothing left standing between the soil and what it has always been capable of becoming.